Good evening, dear guests, dear colleagues, dear Professor Jacques Rancière. I'm really very honored to announce the opening of the Kyiv International 68 Now, which will last for the next 2 weeks here in the House of Cinema. And let me first of all express my deep thankfulness to Professor Jacques Rancière for his presence here. Thank you so much for appreciating our invitation and coming to Kyiv. Thank you. My name is Vasil Cherepanin. I represent Visual Culture Research Center, which is the organizer of the 68 Now project. So the Kyiv International 68 Now is the second edition of the Kyiv International Kyiv Biennial 2017, which our center conducted last fall. And this time, this project explores the political and cultural heritage of the revolt and struggle of '68, considering the antinomies of this crucial historical moment for the West and East of Europe 50 years onward. Our starting point is that '68 is split. On the one hand, May '68 remains a symbol of liberation and rebellion against entrenched power structures and the cultural benchmark for the Western Europe. Whereas in Eastern Europe, it is rather about commemoration of the Prague Spring and Soviet military invasion of Czechoslovakia. This split continues to define the political and cultural divides across the continent. And at the same time, '68 is undoubtedly the beginning of global contemporaneity which we live in. From our institutional perspective, it is very important that we are overlapping all the contrasting dimensions of this event during the project here in Kyiv, in Ukraine, which is not part of the current embodiment of Europe, the EU. As in other projects of ours, we are usually trying to discover some potential for transformation of the European construction under the pressure from the outside, in the context of the so-called bigger Europe. And with the Kyiv International, we are actually following the most famous slogan of May '68, "Be realistic, demand the impossible." Because what we are observing today as a form of a dominant ideology is basically the fusion of neoliberal austerity and reconstructed nationalistic hatred. Nowadays, when it's about militarism, xenophobia, social and economic discrimination, isolationism, impoverishment, they are not just possible, they are welcome. But when it comes to some social basics, minimal welfare, affordable housing, respectful wages, just health care, we are usually told, no, this is impossible now. The boundaries of the possible have radically shifted, and what was impossible and unimaginable even some 10 years ago, wars like in Ukraine or Syria, ISIS, extreme right-wing populism on such a scale, Brexit, Trump, became not just possible, they are accepted as a norm today. And all the attempts of protecting what is still possible are failing, as the space of the existing is constantly narrowing, giving way to really frightening reactionary tendencies across the world. In such difficult political times, it's not enough to defend what little we have, hoping for moderate reforms. On the contrary, witnessing predominantly regressive thanatological trends on a global scale, reforming the existing system becomes impossible, and really changing it appears as a realistic option. That's why it is indeed the only realistic political strategy to demand the impossible. That is what is at stake of genuine politics, the possibility of the impossible. In other words, the impossible is what Professor Jacques Rancière would probably call a disruption in which politics becomes possible. Because if we don't demand the impossible, we will lose what seems to be still possible today. And with 68 Now project, we are trying not to stick to some utopian, impossible position, but quite the opposite, to place the impossible within the current ideological coordinate system. And in that regard, I would also like to draw your attention to the publication which is just appeared in print, the Guidebook of the Kyiv International. You can have a look at it at the entrance to this hall. It is published by Visual Culture Research Center and Medusa Books and designed by an Amsterdam-based graphic design studio, Experimental Jet Set, who also made the emblem of the 68 Now project. And this guidebook is basically the collection of texts by contemporary historians, political philosophers and artists, some of whom were the participants of the Kyiv Biennial 2017. And it is dedicated to the future of the idea of internationalism today. Also, I would like to thank to the House of Cinema for providing its beautiful premises for our events, to our institutional partners and foundations for their kind support, and foremost to the Visual Culture Research Center team, which made this project possible. And as for our notable speaker tonight, Professor Jacques Rancière probably doesn't need a special introduction. This Algerian-born French philosopher made significant contributions to political philosophy, the philosophy of education and aesthetics of the late 20th century. But what I find really fascinating is that May 68 played a key role in Jacques Rancière's political intellectual biography, because it was exactly this event because of which he publicly broke with his teacher, Louis Althusser, over his attitude toward the May 68 uprising. Jacques Rancière felt that Althusser's theoretical stance did not leave enough room for popular uprising. In opposition to Althusser's theoreticist Marxism, Rancière held that workers are capable of understanding their own oppression and of emancipating themselves without guidance from an elite class of theoreticians. Jacques Rancière is emeritus professor at the Department of Philosophy of the University of Paris 8, where he taught from 1968 to 2000. He has written extensively on social emancipation, literature, and cinema. The central theme of Rancière's educational and political philosophies is radical equality. And one of the original aspects of Rancière's thought is his emphasis on aesthetic dimension of politics and the political dimension of aesthetics. Rancière is notably the author of, and I'm naming just few of them, of the following books: Proletarian Nights, The Ignorant Schoolmaster, which is, by the way, translated into Ukrainian, and you can buy it also at the entrance to this hall. Disagreement, Politics and Philosophy, The Politics of Aesthetics, The Emancipated Spectator, Aesthesis, Scenes from the Aesthetic Regime of Art, The Lost Thread, Essays on Modern Fiction. So, welcome, Professor Jacques Rancière, Repoliticizing the French 68. Please give our speaker a very warm welcome. Thank you so much.
So, thank you very much to Vasil Sherepanin for his introduction. Thank you to the Visual Culture Research Center for organizing this event. And thank you to the translator, and thank you to all of you for being here tonight. Well, the remarks that I will present about the sequence of facts known as May 68 in France are not simply destined, for the commemoration of 50th anniversary. They are part of a wider reflection on the relation between three terms: time, narration, and politics. This reflection implies a re-evaluation of the hierarchy of forms of temporality, and it implies an emphasis on those forms of interruption that are most of the time perceived as ephemeral incidents in the long run of historical evolution. It also implies a specific attention to the way in which those interruptions are narrated and to the political uses of memory and history. So there is no particular reason to speak about May 68 every 10 years, of course, but I think a new examination of this sequence and of its interpretation has some consequences that may help us think about the temporality of politics and about the kind of rationality to which politics belongs, and so perhaps to try to analyze its present state. It is from that perspective that I would like to re-examine the conflict of interpretations about the existence or the non-existence of an event called May 68. But before getting to the heart of the matter, I must make two remarks. Firstly, I chose to focus on what happened in France at that moment. This doesn't mean that I ignore the importance of the movements that happened during that period in many other countries, from Czechoslovakia to Mexico, for instance. Nor do I ignore that those movements were part of the wider dynamic of the anti-imperialist movement that went across the world in the 1960s. So the French mid-68 can be thought of as a form of condensation of wider processes, including decolonization in Africa, the struggle against American imperialism in Vietnam, and the struggle against Soviet imperialism in Eastern Europe. But a condensation is precisely a phenomenon that cannot be reduced to the effect of a sum of conditions. It is a singularity, a power of novelty that becomes separated from the totality of its conditions and engenders unexpected outcomes. And if we want to rethink politics, it's important to focus on the autonomous logic of singular events happening at specific moments, instead of dissolving them in the endless web of connection, making them depend on a global process. But it was the first remark. Second remark, when I speak of the interpretations of the event, this doesn't mean that there is the event on the one side and a collection of interpretations on the other one. An event is so due to a mode of narration and interpretation that links the description of a fact or a series of facts with the declaration of a specific significance. Naming it an event means that something has happened that has disturbed the usual course of things. The interpretation doesn't merely provide a reason for the disturbance, it also determines the nature and the kind of rationality under which it falls. You can think, for instance, speaking of a students' protest, that this protest in the university or in the streets results from the action of some agitators, which can always happen anywhere. You can think that it results from malfunctions in the university system that had not been detected early enough. You can interpret it as a symptom of a malaise among the young people that had not been perceived. But in all these cases, the event is analyzed as the deviation produced by a cause that had not been taken into account, which means that in all these forms of interpretation, the interpretation of the deviation from the normal order of expectations remains consistent with this order, meaning that the excess of the event is interpreted as the effect of a lack or lateness. One thinks that those who were in charge of predicting did not do it correctly. But the order of the predictable itself is not disturbed. It is just a matter of adding a few more variables. Such is the logic of the explanation that I analyzed in the Ignorant Schoolmaster. Politically speaking, this is the logic of what I call the police order, an order that reduces the political stage to the interplay of well-identified social groups and with the effects of a global social evolution. But you can take a totally different view of the disturbance and give it a much more radical meaning. In this case, you will not only think that a particular sequence of facts disturbed the normal linkage of causes and effects. You will think that it initiated another form of linkage that upsets this normal causality, that questions the normal way in which facts in general are linked together as causes and effects. And from this perspective, the event is not only the unexpected that happens, it is the unexpected that calls into question the way in which things are expected, in which usually temporal continuity and discontinuity are integrated into a form of rational linkage. Well, identifying a sequence of facts like May 68 as an event thus means identifying not simply a break inside a normal course of things, but the emergence of another form of temporality that sets to work another form of rationality. It is from that angle that I will raise the question, under what conditions can we identify the ensemble of facts designated in France by a date, May 68, as a political event? I will try to show that we can do so if we discern in this sequence a mode of temporal and rational linkage that disrupts the very form of rationality at work in the categories, descriptions, and arguments by means of which politics is normally thought of in the polis order. This implies that we take this sequence away from its dominant mode of interpretation and narration, which I will call the sociological one. Well, I must make here a remark concerning the adjective sociological. I'm not a philosopher polemicizing against sociology. As I use it in this text, it doesn't refer to a specific science or academic discipline. What I call here a sociological mode of interpretation can be implemented in a philosophical argumentation, a journalistic report, or a historical narration as well. It is so because sociology, long before becoming the name of an academic discipline, had been a way of interpreting modern society and even of constructing the very category of modernity. The sociological interpretation defined modernity as a time of crisis in the relation between individuals and the community. That dramaturgy of crisis was first framed long ago at the end of the 18th century as a response to the event of the French Revolution. For the counter-revolutionary thinkers, the French Revolution had destroyed all the social bodies and institutions that served as intermediaries between the individuals and the global society, such as feudal links, corporations, the church, or others. And accordingly, it had left individuals isolated in front of a social totality. And so, the social totality had become an imaginary monster, unleashing the monstrous acts of terror. But in their view, that disaster itself did not come out of the blue. It was the effect of a kind of civilizational disease called individualism. And that disease had started much before with Protestantism, because Protestantism had given to the individuals the privilege of an unmediated relation with the Bible. It had been prolonged by the Enlightenment's principles of putting individual freedom and the spirit of free examination at the very basis of social life and political institutions. And it had reached its peak with the revolutionary rights of man, destroying all the traditional social links. The problem is that this narration and this interpretation of modernity did not remain the sole property of counter-revolutionary thinkers. They became the dominant narrative about modernity, shared by all types of socialism. Socialism, in fact, brought only a small change to the scenario by accusing, instead of Protestantism or the Enlightenment, the power lurking between them, namely capitalism. They all described modern society as a society characterized by the dissolution of community links, drawn in what the Communist Manifesto called the icy water of egotistical calculation. They affirmed the necessity of creating new links, new mediations between the individuals and the totality. So that sociology was first a project of social reorganization. But that which remains from this project is a mode of interpretation which is still vivid, and that can be summed up in two principles. First, there is a nature of social things, which has its laws, like that of natural things. Second, in their ignorance, the ignorance of those laws gives way to the unleashing of the imaginary, which wants to rebuild the society as it likes and only engenders destruction. However, and this is the second principle in this view, that destruction is always ephemeral, and when the destructive cycle is over, the nature of social things resumes its normal course. Well, those principles involved a certain idea, and a restrictive idea of politics. Politics in this conception is thought of as kind of management dedicated to maintaining or reconstituting institutions linking the individuals and the states and harmonizing the interests of the various social groups. They also involved a philosophical axiom, which is that the event only happens when the real is denied. It is, in a way, the disaster that indicates that the stitches of the real have come loose and left to the imaginary some interstices, which it has transformed into bloody ones. But in this view, the wound is always provisional, and the denial of the real is doomed to be denied by the real in turn. Well, according to such principles, what happened in May 68 in France seems to be the imaginary event par excellence. A student revolution, from that point of view, seems to contradict the very status of a group mainly composed of sons of the ruling class and living at a remove from the sphere of economic and social conflict. Of course, the event itself in 68 fully contradicted that diagnosis. The student revolt in 68 unleashed a movement which in 2 weeks spread over a whole country and undermined all the hierarchical institutions and all the ways of thinking governing a society and legitimizing a government. So that conflagration seemed to refute the sociological worldview. Very soon, however, the return to order allowed the latter to turn it into its confirmation. A few months after May, the leading figure of French academic sociology, who was also a leading intellectual of the French right, Raymond Aron, published a book simply called The Elusive Revolution. His interpretation of the events was a mere reassertion of the two axioms of the sociological worldview. First, he said, this turmoil had happened because of a constitutive default of modern society, the lack of intermediary bodies and collective links. Second, for the same reason, it could only be an imaginary event. France, he said, lacks those intermediary bodies that are required to tackle the complexity of modern societies. Individuals, and especially young individuals, are doomed to loneliness. Why, he did not say. This lack of real bonds provokes an imaginary overinvestment, so that the students' revolt could be described as a big carnival of dreamed brotherhood. But in his view, the same reason that accounted for the event explained why it could not be the revolution it was hoped to be. The 68 so-called elusive revolution happened, he said, because there was a lack of intermediary bodies. But it was doomed to remain an imaginary revolution because there was at least one real intermediary body in the case, namely the French Communist Party, who knew how to protect the working class from the contagion of the students' movement and collaborate with the government to maintain the normal interplay of social relationships. Well, with the decline of both leftist movements and the Communist Party, the sociological interpretation of 68 has become increasingly prominent. In serious academic sociology and ordinary journalistic prose as well, May 68 has been told to be the big surge of the so-called baby boomers, nurtured by the economic prosperity of the so-called glorious 30 years after the Second World War, and eager to cast off the yoke of patriarchal authority in order to fully enjoy the pleasures of consumer society and sexual freedom. A very serious French academic historian wrote a book precisely called The Baby Boomers, And he said the 68 events in the wake of a societal and moral revolution, a hedonistic revolution, whose turning point for him occurred 3 years before, in 1965. Why? Because, at that very year, 1965, the move towards so-called hedonistic values could be perceived through a number of converging symptoms. For instance, the slowdown of religious vocations, or the apparition of nudity in films and magazines, and the emergence of an emblematic long-haired singer called Antoine, who called for the sale of contraceptive pills in supermarkets. Then a big book written by 2 sociologists, The New Spirit of Capitalism, made a further step. For the authors, the spirit of 68 had been the ideological matrix of the rejuvenation of capitalist culture and capitalist forms of management. Well, their diagnosis remained predicated on the key principles of sociological interpretation. There are, they said, 2 main types of critique. There is social critique, and social critique fights against egoism and inequality in the name of the values of solidarity. And on the other hand, there is artistic critique, which pits the dominant order against the individualistic values of autonomy and creativity. The first critique, social critique, belongs, they said, to the working class tradition. The second one characterizes the student movement. And it is the latter which gave to capitalism the intellectual instruments enabling it to legitimize new alternative forms of management and so to undermine working class resistance by taking up to its advantage the so-called artistic and individualistic values that the students had opposed to the tradition of social critique. Well, in such a way, the dominant interpretation of May 68 in France has become a perfect case of concordance between the sociological mode of thinking and its object. This sequence of facts has been stripped from any political relevance and reduced to a typical example of a carnival, an imaginary event expressing an underlying sociological process ignored by the actors of the event. I think, however, that it is possible to read this kind of concordance between a discourse and its object the other way around. It might be the case that May 68 is a kind of event that this sociological mode of interpretation must reduce to quasi nothing in order to validate its own presuppositions. And it is possible to draw from the examination of this sequence a totally different analysis of the temporality of the event, along with a totally different view of what politics means. When we embark on a new examination of the May 68 sequence in France, one thing first strikes us. The motivations and the practices of those activists were quite far from the images conveyed by the sociological retrospective interpretation. No guitar players, no youths with long hair among those who occupied the universities and marched in the streets, no claim against the family order, few calls to sexual freedom, no exaltation of artistic creativity, no claim of the youth as such. From the outset, from through to the end, the movement focused on the relationship between the university system and capitalist domination. It emphasized the way in which the academic system expressed the domination of a class and prepared those that it trained to become agents and accomplices of that domination. We don't want to be trained in order to become the instruments of the capitalist exploitation of the working class. Such is the main theme that goes across the whole sequence from the first conflicts, about specific matters of exams at the University of Nanterre in the suburbs, through to the massive street protests in the streets of Paris. Well, in a groundbreaking shortcut, A leaflet of that time calls for, I quote, the abolition of the exams and capitalism. From the beginning to the end, the movement used the themes and arguments of the social critic, and mostly those of the Marxist theory of class war. More importantly, the main target of the critique was precisely the new culture of modernized capitalist management that the May movement in retrospective analysis is told to have fostered. As a matter of fact, that new culture already existed in our countries under the name of neo-capitalism. That rejuvenated form of capitalism was supposed to be oriented toward growth to the benefit of everybody instead of individual profit. And so the place of the university system and the social science in that new form of capitalism had been, in the years before 1968, at the center of an intense intellectual activity in France. There had been 2 highly publicized conferences calling for the modernization of the university system and its adaptation to the ends of economic growth and social cohesion. So it's no coincidence that the 1968 movement started from the new, modern and progressive University of Nanterre, and more precisely, among the students of the new and progressive Department of Sociology, a discipline that had just been emancipated, from the supervision of philosophy at that moment. And the first contribution given to the movement by the leader who would become the incarnation of May 1968, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, was a contribution to a polemical manifesto entitled Why Sociologists? But it's not simply a matter of opposing the slogans of May 1968 to the retrospective images of the baby boomer surge. That which deserves attention is the dynamic expressed by those slogans. It is a set of connections between the universities, the streets, and global society that was at work in the forms of thinking and action of that sequence, and in the very articulation between thinking and action. So behind the conflict opposing the would-be revolutionary students to the reformist state, there is, I think, a more radical conflict between 2 ideas of politics. There is, on the one side, what I've called the polis logic. According to that logic, political action consists in settling a balance between the forces that compose a society. So in that view, a political conflict is the symptom of a change provoking an imbalance in the relations between social forces, and that change requires a readjustment by experts, of course. What is at work in the 1968 movement is a completely opposite view of politics. That view makes politics an activity with a rationality of its own. And I think that politics, as a matter of fact, deserves this name inasmuch as it is the work of specific subjects. Those subjects are not social groups or representatives of social groups. They are not defined by their identity, but by their acts. And what is characteristic of those acts is to displace precisely the very lines of distribution of social identities and the very modes of articulation between words and actions and between spaces and time. They change the very mode of articulation between actions so as to create a new common space, a common space of manifestation of capacities and possibilities that did not exist in the normal distribution of places, activities, and capacity. In other words, I would say politics exists thanks to the suppression of the mediations and intermediaries that constitute the very consistency of a society according to the sociological view. Well, I mentioned earlier the shortcut formulated by a student's manifesto between the exams and capitalism in general. But I think that political subjectivation in general can be defined as an art of the shortcut that directly links a local problem to the whole of a social system of domination. Well, in my book, The Ignorant Schoolmaster, I analyzed the 2 opposite ways in which it is possible to link the part to the whole according to the thinker of intellectual emancipation, Joseph Jacotot. On the one side, there is the inegalitarian logic, or the police logic, in which the part can only be understood in relation to the whole and according to a process whose steps must be followed in a determined order with a learned guide. On the other side, there is the emancipatory logic, according to which everything is in everything, which is not commonplace as it looks, because it means that it is possible from any point of departure to find a path, making it possible to link this particularity to other ones and to invent step by step a still unknown method of linkage. We can say then that the apparent naivety of students who demand at once the abolition of exams and the abolition of capitalism sets to work an emancipated politics. The activist students in this case invent from their specific position a process of condensation of the power relations that govern the social order. They decide that the issue of the exams is not a mere empirical point, that it contains in itself the whole of the relation between the university and the social system. And that this relation between the university and the social system in turn may condense for political action the whole of the social organization of domination. So they decide by the question of that relation between the exams and global capitalist domination. This question can be raised directly by skipping all the mediations that normally mark out the steps, meaning the distance between their situation and a global struggle against capitalism. At that moment, for instance, the institutional left, the left-wing official parties said that there were many steps to get over, a big distance, between the revolutionary aspirations of the students and the reality of their situation of privileged inheritors. So many things were needed first, before any kind of revolt. Many things were needed. First, a more democratic recruitment of the students. Second, the acquisition by the students of the science of the historical process. Third, the subordination of student action to workers' trade unionism. And fourth, of course, the subordination of trade unionism in general to the avant-garde party, instructed by science. Well, the suppression of those mediations has been vilified in the Marxist tradition by a stigmatizing name. It has been called spontaneism. And spontaneism has been characterized as a propensity for immediate action and the faith in the capacity of the oppressed to act by themselves without being guided by the knowledge of the historical process and the leadership of a conscious avant-garde. But from the very meaning of the word spontaneity, it is possible to put the argument the other way around. What is spontaneous in a social order is not savage rebellion. It is business as usual. It is a way of thinking and acting in accordance with the existing order of the perceptible, the thinkable, and the doable. What is spontaneous is the faith in the necessity of the existing order. It is a subordination to the mediations and intermediaries that embody that necessity. In contradistinction, the organization of political struggle begins, perhaps, with the affirmation of the contingency of this so-called necessity. It begins with the invention of sequences of words and acts that draw out the consequences of that contingency, and in so doing, open up an expected field of possibilities and an often open field for unexpected capacities. It begins with the suspension of the authority of social science, in a way, or in the pretension of science, to provide the theoretical weapons of the struggle. I think that the same reversal affects the temporal category of the ephemeral. It is customary to pit long-term revolutionary strategies against the ephemeral upsurge of revolts. But the movements that are called ephemeral actually make breaks in the ordinary course of long-term time, which is a time of endless mediations and postponements. And it is out of those breaks that a specifically political time can emerge. It is not incidental that the political subjects who constitute themselves by breaking with the distribution of social identity, those political subjects often owe their name to a date. It is well known that the main organizer of the 68 demonstrations in France was not defined by a social composition or a program. No. In fact, it was defined by a contingent birth date. The 22 Mars, so the 22nd March movement, owed its name just to the date of an improvised protest on the campus of Nanterre. And I think that perhaps this reminds us that politics is not the power of a social force of all program. It is the power of new beginnings that initiate a new temporal thread, diverging from the normal social evolution. That which characterizes this new time is a change in speed. Well, I said earlier that a political event implies the creation of shortcuts between singular points in the social order. In the same way, it can be said that it implies an acceleration in a sequence of actions, and in the very invention of scenes and forms of action. That's why the 22nd March movement positively affirmed that they had no political program, as people usually have it. They did not define a series of steps between the present situation and the future of the seizure of power. Instead, they provocatively said they just had a grasp on what was happening and on its consequence for the next 3 or 4 days. Well, it was a provocation, of course, but the provocation did not simply reverse the ordinary relation between the short term and the long term. More radically, the 22nd March activists pitted against police rationality, another linkage between time and causality, a rationality of political action which is immanent to the very development of action instead of being calculated according to programs of steps to be taken on the way to power. Political temporality, in this view, is not determined by a progression of steps toward an end. Instead, it is determined by a succession of actions that undo the locks or the mediations that prevent a movement from developing its immanent power of universalization, its own capacity of confronting the whole of the social distribution of identities, places, and powers. In other terms, it is not a matter of moving closer and closer to a power taken as the end of the action. It is a matter of increasing a power that is already at work. And this is what is entailed in a concept that was one of the key words of May 68, the concept of exemplary action. Well, the meaning of this notion has often been misunderstood. An exemplary action is not an action that serves as a model for other actions, nor is it an action providing an exemplary revelation on the nature of domination. As was defined in a text of the 22nd March movement, it is an action that will move beyond itself and be brought beyond itself. It does not simply mean that the actions create a new situation. It means that it disrupts the normal system of the stage of an action determined by the play of the mediations between the part and the whole. The autonomous dynamic of the exemplary action unlocks the barriers that separate the local protest from the global struggle against the system. In order to do so, it must change the nature and the scope of the acts of protest. The same text written by the activists of the 22nd March, sees this modification, in the way in which the movement occupied the streets and the university. First, they did not simply protest in the streets. They held the streets. They invented in the streets a new collective power based on the equal participation of everybody. Well, the erection of the barricades, it was quite ephemeral, but it was important in this respect, because those barricades were not simply a means of collective protection against the police. They were the constitution of a collective, meaning the transformation of anonymous individuals, students, inhabitants of the area, passers-by in the street or else, the transformation of all those anonymous individuals into a collective, and transformation that was done by the very fact of using their individual imagination and their hands to build them together. Well, as regards the occupation of the university, so the idea to occupy first the Sorbonne and then all the university was taken up, of course, from past workers' strikes, and notably from the occupation of the factories during the big strikes in France in 1936. But it was transposed in a way that changed the very meaning of that practice. Unlike the occupation of factories, the occupation of the university in May 1968 was an open occupation, which means that the students invited factory workers and all kinds of people to come and take part in it. So the occupation of the university was not an affirmation of a student power over their workplace. Instead, it was an attempt at changing the very function and meaning of that place, an attempt at tearing away the university from the normal distribution and hierarchy of social institutions. Well, those ways of acting in the streets and in the university are exemplary in as much as, well, they create forms of participation of individuals, forms of linkage of actions, and forms of transformation of situations that widen the field of possible. That's why they could produce effects, beyond the very barriers opposed to the propagation of the movement. And this is what happened notably regarding the relationship between the student movement and the strike in the factories, that started after the occupation of the Sorbonne. So after the occupation of the Sorbonne by the students, the movement of occupation, spread in the factories, but without any order, coming from the trade union leaders, by kind of spontaneous decision, so there were workers in a small workshop deciding, to get into another workshop, and to have people, rise and stop working and occupying. Well, then, of course, the functionaries of the trade unions closed the doors of the factories to avoid the interferences of the student movement. They negotiated with the government. They exerted pressure in the factories for the acceptance of the agreement. But in spite of all that pressure, the majority of the strikers rejected the agreement. And it was not expected at all, but it could be thought as an effect precisely of the very dynamic of exemplary actions, let us say, even beyond the barriers. And I think this is a sense that can be made of an other famous May 1968 slogan, which reads, "Power to the imagination, imagination au pouvoir." Well, this slogan has often been understood as the power given to an outburst of carnivalesque fantasy. But imagination is not dreamlike fantasy. Imagination is the invention of forms, and politics too is an invention of forms. Far from being a youth carnival, the May 1968 sequence can make us perceive what politics means as a power of collective invention of the new. It is the invention of names that break social identities, the invention of actions that burst apart the mediations defining the consensual order. It is a transformation of spaces, transformation of the material and symbolic use of spaces. And it is the unfolding of an autonomous and accelerated time. Well, such inventions are usually thought as a manifestation of spontaneous and ephemeral revolt. But it can easily be ascertained that it is those momentary disruptions of the normal state of things that bring into existence a specific temporality of politics. This doesn't mean that politics exists only in a few exceptional moments of insurrection. No. It means that it is as a result of such interruptions of normal police time that there is a history and a tradition of political invention distinct from the history of social forces and state institutions. Which means, for instance, that the barricades erected in May 68 for a few hours were not merely nostalgic and anachronistic repetitions of those erected in 19th century Paris. They took place within a political tradition of invention of other ways of using spaces and times, words and gesture. The political moments don't dissolve like ephemeral bubbles, at the surface, on the surface, of social reality. The temporal accelerations, the reconfigurations of spaces, the unexpected sequences of actions, all those forms of action create ways of perceiving, feeling, thinking, and active that are active forces of struggle and transformation. So, for instance, the European revolutions of 1848 were crushed everywhere, okay, but they gave birth to huge social and political movements in the long run. In the same way, the 68 movements were defeated, but they created dynamics of action and forms of symbolization of conflict that in turn created the possibility of new forms of collective affirmation. In France, that dynamic animated a long resistance to the so-called neoliberal offensive, long after it had triumphed in Reagan's United States or Thatcher's England or Germany, etc. And that resistance, was punctuated by massive and victorious strikes of workers and students in 1986, 1995, and still 2006. And all over the world, you know how the spirit of those years, not only the spirit of May 68 in France, but the spirit of those years was revived in the big street protests and Occupy movements that took place since 2011 from Tunisia and Egypt to Ukraine, Spain, Greece, Turkey, United States, Hong Kong, France, and several other countries. It is then possible, I think, to identify the 68 sequence as a specific political event, a moment of rediscovery of some fundamental characteristics of political conflicts. This is not to say that it revealed a kind of pure essence of politics. If the event is significant, it is also because of the ambiguous relation between that political practice and the Marxist framework with which it was conceived by the participants themselves. On the one hand, the 68 activists conceived of their action within the framework of the Marxist tradition of class struggle. On the other hand, their practice of politics was at odds with the Marxist tradition of strategic action. And this ambiguity can be read in two opposite ways. Either as the incapacity of the movement to break with the sociological view of the revolution led by a social force, guided by avant-garde, or conversely, as the effective break with that paradigm, even though it was still claimed in theory. On the one side, it can be said that the movement did not possess the theory of its practice. Its shortcuts and accelerations broke on the ground with the strategic model of action, subordinating political action to the science of society. It broke with the definition of the legitimate political actors, with the hierarchy of the forms of actions and the progressions of steps determined by this model. Nevertheless, the movement still conceived of its ends in the terms of this paradigm. So they sent their militants to the gates of the factories, where the functionaries of the Communist Party turned them back. They called for street demos, but the latter disowned, and they created action committees to short-circuit them. Nevertheless, they continued thinking of their own action as a kind of auxiliary action that must be subordinated to the leadership of the working class and of its organizations. So in a way, it can be said that they still thought in the framework of the conception of a legitimate leading force of the revolutionary process. But it is possible, even though they denounced the party embodying it, as a force of repression. But it's possible to perceive the contradiction the other way round. One can then say that the revival of the Marxist vocabulary, concepts and emblems, which was very important in '68, there were red flags on all the factories, all the everywhere there were red flags. But it can be said perhaps that this revival hid the reality of a break with the Marxist idea of the social revolution brought by the historical process and led by the conscious avant-garde of the social group. And from that point of view, the call made to the party that should lead the movement was a way to show that its real role was to repress it. And the link was made between that soft repression, of the May movement by the French Communist Party and the violent repression of the Prague Spring by the Warsaw Pact troops. But the main point is not about the break of the '68 activists with the Communist Party. It is, if the sequence is significant, I think, it is because of a more radical break immanent to its very dramaturgy. Well, I think that the conventional oppositions between spontaneity and organization and so on hide a deeper paradox. The political shortcut that lifts the locks and steps engenders an immanent process of development, but this autonomous process is no longer thinkable as a process oriented toward a last step to reach or a last lock to undo. Both the students in the occupied faculties and the workers in the occupied factories both affirmed that they wanted to go further, to go all the way through to the end. But this end could no more be objectified. This gap can be perceived in a text which has often been viewed as the chart of the May '68 movement, the text entitled Amnesty for Blind Eyes, elaborated by a reflection group called Nous sommes en marche, we are on our way. This text is constructed, in a very formal way as a series of theses, and among those theses there is a 25th thesis that says, we want the means to our ends. It seems to be clear, but this statement follows a sentence that has precisely brushed aside the question about the ends of the movement. I quote, "When people ask us to say where we are going, we should not answer. We are not in power. We don't need to be positive or justify our excesses." End of quote. And the same sentence that claims the means to our ends continues with a clarification which, in fact, points to radical displacement in the very conception of that end. So I quote, "We want the means to our ends, that is to say, if not power, at least a power from which all forms of oppression and violence would be excluded as a basis for its existence and means for its survival." End of quote. Well, this convoluted statement doesn't only express, the desire of a non-violent power, of course, in opposition to the idea of the dictatorship of the Revolutionary Party. I think that there is something more, that it evinces a displacement in the very conception of power. Power is no longer the objective that must be reached by the means of revolutionary action, and it is no longer the instrument which provides the means to achieve the ends of a social transformation. Well, it is not this kind of power that is affirmed. It is the power that is deployed here and now, the collectivization of a capacity of thinking and acting that belongs to everybody. So, because it is not the cleverness of smart strategies that allows the shortcuts of actions and makes them efficient. Really, all the strategies, in May '68, they were totally improvised, totally improvised on the ground. So it is not the the cleverness of smart strategists that was at work. It was the unforeseeable capacity of anybody, a capacity that was enacted by a multitude of grassroots organizations in the factories and the neighborhoods, or even anonymous individuals in the street. So we want the means to our ends, they said, but it is no longer a matter of the end justifying the means. No longer a case for strategists able to determine the right relation of means to ends. On the contrary, it's a matter of abolishing the distance that the instrumental and strategic mode of thinking sets between end and means. It is a matter of merging them into an homogeneous process that becomes the unfolding of its own power. And this power cannot be anymore gauged by measuring the steps taken on the way leading to a takeover. It becomes autonomous by distancing itself from the word of the enemy rather than taking up arms against it. This is what I tried to sum up once in a formula, which of course, has the limits of any formula. Politics is not a conflict of forces, it's a conflict of words. The barricade is a self-affirmation of a community of equals rather than an efficient means of fighting against the enemy. Well, what is interesting is that Marx had already gauged the full extent of the gap when he analyzed the life and death of the Paris Commune in 1871. To those who criticized the Commune for not taking enough social measures, he replied that its greatest social measure was its very existence. It was the demonstration of the full capacity of ordinary men and women to do what was not supposed to be their business, namely to organize a common word at every level and to organize it as a word of equals where all the public functions that had previously been the privilege of a social hierarchy became workers' tasks on an equal footing. And this is, after all, what the word communism designates, notably in Marx's 1844 manuscripts. What communism designates is a capacity for action which is an end in itself, and defines a word in which the very distinction between ends and means has disappeared, along with the distinction between leaders and executors. But in Marx's view, and this was the paradox, the very enactment of this communist nature of the commune, had a damaging effect. The Paris Commune was so busy, he said, giving birth to a new society, that they did not care for the cannibals, meaning the army of the bourgeois power, who were on the doorsteps of the town. What is at issue in this carelessness of the commune is not kind of mistake caused by an excess of naivety. It is, I think, the very contradiction between the conflict of forces and the power of world making, between a way of doing that separates ends and means and a way of doing that doesn't separate them. Well, it is true that this gap, between two types of conflict of forces and conflict of words, could be bridged for a long time in modern history, as long as it was possible to identify under the name of working class three things: a part of the social body, a force of struggle, and a power of creating a new world. As long as it was possible, it was also possible to translate a conflict of words into a conflict of forces. From that point of view, I think that the May '68 sequence was a turning point. Even though the call made to the working class was still faithful the scenario that gave to a social class the capacity of engendering a new world, the very development of the movement refuted that scenario. The capacity of everybody, in a way, affirmed itself autonomously, quite separately from an identification to a social group. The power of the event undid the knot between the conflict of forces and the power of world-making, between social force and political subject. It made the dissociation perceptible on the political stage and the theoretical stage as well. Since that time, the destruction of the factories in the Western world, the dispersion of the working class, and the relocation of industrial work far away in Asia made this separation manifest in the very landscape of our countries. The factories toward which the students had marched in May '68 to claim the unity between students and workers, those factories have all been destroyed and replaced by condos, shopping malls, or cultural centers. Now, you need a badge to get into the University of the Sorbonne. That was the art of the '68 movement. The dissociation then becomes all condensed in one word and one practice, inherited from that time, occupation. We know how this word has been revived in the democratic movement of the 2010s. Occupation has become, in a way, the very word, or occupying, or occupation have become the very words expressing the global refusal of the dominant order and the break with the dominant temporality. It created new forms of manifestation of the capacity of anybody, new shortcuts between local situations or local incidents and a whole system of domination. It created new forms of the acceleration of time. So the practices of occupation in the squares of the towns or the communes improvised in places threatened by big industrial projects gave its utmost visibility to the idea of politics as a conflict of words. But that conflict of words was no longer connected to any conflict of social group and any identification of a social force carrying a new word to come. The process of occupation in the occupying movements was no more what it had been in the past, and still in '68, meaning the blockage of a functional place in the process of capitalist production and social reproduction. It no longer took place in factories and universities. It mainly took place besides the place emblematic of financial capitalism as Wall Street, of course occupying Wall Street and state power. The tents set up on the occupied squares and even the self-defense installations of the new communes appeared to be forms of affirmation of cessation rather than forms of organization of an army, struggling to seize the power. And the very slogan, I think, of the Occupy Wall Street movement, calling to occupy everything, compensates for the fact that there is no specific place now where the manifestation of a community of equals can coincide with the blockage of a cog in the social machinery. While many people have criticized the Occupy movement and the movement of the squares, saying that they were mere repetitions of the movement of the '68, that they had no strategic view, etc., etc. Well, I think that those critics are a bit superficial. I think that it would be more useful to realize that perhaps the '68 movement was a real breach, beyond which the conflict of words can no longer be associated with a conflict of social groups and the development of a historical process. And of course, what an emancipatory politics can be in this new context has become both an enigma and a challenge. Thank you for your patience.
Mr. Rancière, you describe very well the revolution of 1968 as and its main value as a process itself. Yes, during this process, like the students, the working class, they invited new forms of organization, like the new imaginations of new forms of politics and society and so on. And also you said that it was influenced by Marxist tradition, But as I see here a really deep contradiction and void of Marx is in the terms that, like, this process, it's kind of the result. You told that when people asked where should we go, like what is our goal, and you said that like we shouldn't answer for it. Yes, that everybody could understand it for himself. But in this case, I see that even the Paris Commune, like which was 100 years earlier, was more progressive in the way that it was closer to the ideal of dictatorship of proletariat, because like the people, the working class, they seized the means of production, they had the power, and there was more place to reinvent the new social forms of co-living, of equality. But in the revolution of 1968, like as I see, the ideas was born inside academia, inside the students, and it's still dying inside the academia even 50 years after. Like we see it in Ukraine and France and all over the world, like when the students had no goal to seize the means of production, yeah, and okay, it lasts for a month, but what is the result? What kind of forms was realized? We see that for these 50 years, the new forms of oppression was invented by capitalism through media, through culture and social and political forms, through imperialistic forms. But 50 years ago, at least, like the Paris people had support from, for example, Soviet bloc. Yeah, even if they didn't support it, but still, at least we had this binary system of Western and Eastern world. But now, like the total rule of capitalism. And is it really have a value, this process of 1968, if it hasn't a goal, if it was just a spontaneous creation of forms, but still, like, this spontaneously went nowhere, like, and it seems more even reactionary than progressive form of protest. Thank you.
Okay, no, I think that of course, it's open.
It works, right?
Yeah, you have to just be closer. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think not, but there are several points, you know. The main point, and in Marxism too, you know, is that there is a tension that has really went, you know, in the whole history also of Marxism, you know. Because at the very beginning, you know, the idea of communism is the idea of this kind of suppression of the very distance, you know, between the end and the mean, and this is what Marx says, you know, in the 1840s, you know, when he is in Paris, you know, and meeting, you know, the German communist workers in Paris, and saying for them, you know, but communism is already a form of life, you know, and it is a problem. In fact, it's a problem of emancipation in general. But emancipation is always already a form of life, a way of being at the same time inside and outside. You know? So I think that in a way, you know, the strategic, you know, conception, you know, in Marxism, have been, you know, added, you know, have been, you know, grafted, you know, on this kernel, you know, of communism, of emancipation as being, in a way, its end in itself, you know. And well, this is a point, and this is something, but of course reappears more strongly. Well, precisely because if you think of the Paris Commune, you know, the Paris Commune, well, it was linked to the idea that, well, precisely the working class was at the same time a kind of homogeneous social group, you know, a force of struggle, and you know, the principle of a new world, and this is what Marx says, you know, in a way, you know, they organize society as a workshop, in a way, you know, as a kind of egalitarian workshop, you know. So now the point is precisely that, well, if you think of 60 '68, there was still this kind also a kind of tension tension between this will, in a way to emancipate immediately, and the face, of the face in the historical process. But the problem is that the historical process was supposed to be linked, to the evolution of the working class, etc., etc. And what happened? So what happened is that in European countries, the working class, which was more or less, really bearing, the hopes and the hopes of the future, it has simply disappeared. Which doesn't mean that there are no more workers, but there are no more workers, of course, in our countries. But which means, that the identification, between a positive social class, and the force of the future, it doesn't work anymore, because the workers, the kind of work that was made, really in Paris or in the suburbs of Paris, at that moment. Now it is made in Cambodia, it is made in Malaysia, it is made in China, and in China the workers live mostly, in conditions of early capitalism or slavery. That's the point, But really, it's not simply, a matter of saying that you cannot stay, you cannot stay in a spontaneous, process. You have to be organized. But what kind of organization? Because I think this kind of proposition was predicated on, in fact, this kind of sociological identification, of a force of the future, and it is that identification that had been broken. It had not been broken, by the students, etc. No, it had been broken by it's true, the development of capitalism, and capitalism knew certainly knew better how to invent, than communism or emancipatory movements. Certainly in the last 50 years, that's true. But at the same time, I think we have to think, on the basis of the real movements. So I think if we want to think of politics, you can have all kinds of critiques, regarding, for instance, 68 in France, regarding the movements of that period, or regarding, the Occupy movements. But in a way, it is where politics exists when it exists, or emancipatory politics exists when it exists,
Yeah. Yeah, another question from there, yeah.
Dear Professor, my name is Andrei Kuglashov, and I had the honor to take part in 2 revolutions here in Occupy Edmonton, in Russian White Ribbon Movement against election fraud. And I wanted you to speak something in defense of having a strategy, maybe in what way of understanding the word strategy we may need it, because seeing how people put their lives on stake and doing enormous efforts for the vision they have, for some change they want to reach, and not being able to help them to focus these efforts in a way, in a transformative way, is disappointing, and it may discourage the future generations of activists. So, and since I also founded Actions Institute here on advanced strategies, and I'm having a slight disagreement on the way that strategy may be useless. So would you be so kind to find some applications and meanings of strategy that really can work for the movements to achieve what they want to achieve?
Okay, I'm not a specialist in strategy, but it's no. I think that we must also think, that we are in a sense in front of a kind of new problem, because when we of course I speak, for my generation, you know. So when we, meaning the people of my generation, and there are not many of them here, of course, when we were young, you know, in a way, you know, well, the historical process, it existed. The working class, it existed, and we could, and I could see the workers, you know, getting out, you know, of the factory at the end of the avenue, you know, every day. Well, now, and so in fact, you know, we must think that also that all those strategies of that moment, you know, were predicated on kind of idea that there was a kind of sociological basis that would never collapse, that was able really, well, to found any kind of strategy. And now I think, well, it appears that the strategic. I remember when I was young, you know, there were all these discussions, you know, about, you know, the alliances between classes, you know, and there was a great big sophistication. You know, intellectuals writing a lot of books, you know, to know with what kind of peasantry, you know, it was possible to make an alliance, you know, and to what division of the petit bourgeoisie it was possible, etc. But all this, and this was strategy at the moment, an effort to identify, you know, to identify. But I think those identifications have collapsed, you know. So now the question of strategy, well, is the question what really is more really about the question what can come after an action, you know, and not how can the action, you know, be integrated in the historical process, etc. How can we connect in this action, you know, a part of peasantry, a part of the working class, part of intellectual, etc. No, but what can be precisely done out of this action? So what kind of, for instance, of institutions, you know, can be invented, you know, on the basis of this or that action, you know, because of course it's always easy to say, but no problem, you know, all this is spontaneous, but we have to create now to recreate the party, and if we recreate the party, we can take the power, and if we take the power, we can make the revolution. Okay, but we know that, but it doesn't make much sense, you know, and so the question is, what can come after, you know. No, I think, for instance, you know, of the role of what you know the Greek movement, you know, calls the free social spaces, you know. So the idea of the possibility of some spaces which at the same time, you know, while provide some kind of social service, you know, health, education, etc., and at the same time, you know, are part of a struggle. So at the same time, you know, well, you know, organizations struggling against capitalism, you know, and organizations creating some kind of non-capitalist life to, you know, here and now, you know. Well, this is you know, a kind of thing. So, but basically, yes, we must think, you know, that. There is no evidence, you know. There is no evidence. There is no solution. There is no solution. It's a matter of really inventing. So there were, of course, there were some forms of organization of autonomous life, you know, on the squares, you know. And what perhaps it was possible to imagine forms, you know, forms of solidarity, you know, going after, and forms and forms of organization playing several roles at the same time, you know. No, because basically, I think we cannot anymore, you know, think of strategy, you know, in the old terms. And I'm not against strategy in general. I don't say that, you know, only spontaneity is good. No, I say spontaneity means, you know, acting in accordance to what happens, you know. And sometimes some people don't act in accordance with the normal course of things. And the question for them, and it's true that nobody actually found the solution in the movements of the last 10 years. As well. What can we do? What can we do after? Knowing that there is no solution, no pre-existing solution. When I was young, there were pre-existing solutions. And it could be said after 68. Well, but of course it was just spontaneity, students' revolt. In fact, there were 9 million workers, in the factories, in strike and occupying. So it was not simply a student movement. But it was possible to say, but of course it was a mistake because you need the leadership of the working class, etc., etc. But that working class, in my country, it did not exist. It did not exist anymore. The last struggles are struggles, of workers trying to avoid, to avoid the disparition of their factory. Well, usually the more than they get is a better indemnity. There was we have to rethink, strategy on the basis of this reality, you would say.
So let's take the question from the center and probably from the left.
The left has no question.
Yeah. Still remain silent.
Thank you for a very good and very dense lecture. My question might seem broad, but
Please, microphone. Can you speak a bit louder?
So thank you for the very dense lecture. My question might seem very broad, but I would ask about the institutions. They are transforming, and the universities are not the same. So firstly, we had mock universities and commercial universities, for-profit universities, and now we have an online education, which is now making a university sphere a non-appropriate, maybe, place for occupying because it's all virtual. And also, as we see, factories are outplaced to Indonesia. So there is this void space which we can occupy, which are squares, which lack institutional structure. They're basically not occupying anything by occupying squares. But so what should we do in order to think about the proper result? So should we invent institutions here? Or should we occupy offices? Should we go to Malaysia? What sort of institutional action should be done, or what institutions are good to look up to? Thank you.
Well,
The Leninist question.
No, I think yes. I think it's it's always the same problem. Perhaps we have to de-fetishize, the notion of institution, because we have a historical model of institutions, Well, and certainly those models cannot work anymore, And it's true that. And for me, there are two questions. When you ask what strategy do we need, the first question is for me, what do we want? Because the problem is, for me, it's still the same, and it is what I try to say, by answering to former questions, So I've spent a very long time, working on workers' emancipation, and on precisely I always came upon this kind of ambiguity, An emancipatory movement is at the same time supposed to be a tool, organization for the future, but at the same time, it's a way of being, a way of being in an overworld. Already, here and now, and so the question is about all those movements. Of course, you can say they failed, but in what exactly did they fail? You know, because you can say, well, they failed because they did not organize. You know, as for instance, the Communist Party, it did not took over the power, but took over the power for what? You know, for what? You know, is the problem? Is the problem? You know, is it a problem now? You know, to reconstruct? You know, all the old-style Communist Party trying to take over the power? You know, and for what? And for doing what? Because we have in our back, you know, the question of what happened, you know, of all those organizations and institutions that had been created for revolution, for equality, for invention, and so on. So I think the first question is perhaps those movements don't want something, you know, beyond themselves, you know. And this was a problem of the Paris Commune. This was still the problem, and this is still the problem. And so if which means, is it possible now, you know, to define an end, you know, of the movement or goal of the movement that doesn't, you know, proceed from the movement itself, you know. So I think, well, there were a lot of movements. Some people tried, you know, to prolong them, you know, so to create some organizations like those free social spaces in Greece, okay. So I think the question of doing something more, you know, of going further, is not the same as the question of, you know, defining a goal, you know, and defining the steps, you know, to reach this goal, you know. So I think the question is about, well, the capacity, the power that is immanent to the movement itself, you know. Perhaps if a movement cannot invent, you know, new ends, new goals, perhaps it depends on its very nature. It doesn't depend from the fact that it doesn't know, you know, the historical process, etc. No, it depends that now we have to invent future out of the present. You know, for a very long time, you know, the future was clear, the future was well defined, you know. And there was a question how to go from the present to the future. And now I think it appears that it is only the present that creates futures, you know. And of course, some present, you know, are strong enough, you know, to create some kind of anticipation, you know, during the struggle, you know, and after it becomes very difficult. Or perhaps, you know, some movements in a way are satisfied, you know, within themselves, you know.
Yeah. And probably, if it's okay for you, one last question. Yeah, okay. Yeah, the last.
No sound.
Yeah.
Okay,
thank you.
thanks.
So I already have the microphone, so it can be my question, yes. So I would like to ask you to bring in some kind of personal experience, some personal dimension of the events of 16/8. What I mean is, do you have a kind of, I don't know, maybe personal memory or an anecdote you can share that for you embodies what was 16/8? Because actually you participated in it and you maybe witnessed something or partook in something, so I guess that would be a good note to finish on. Thanks.
So what do we want of me exactly?
Just, a memory, maybe an episode you partook or witnessed, something for you that is 16/8 encapsulated.
He's pushing you into nostalgia, you know.
No,
it's a reactionary question.
No, I don't think so. Well, I think for me, perhaps 68. Well, perhaps it can be condensed, you know. In this, there was a moment, you know, when there was no more oil, you know, no more possibility, you know, of displacement. You know. So everybody was walking, you know, and everybody was in the streets, and many people in the streets, you know, and people discussing. Normally in the streets of Paris, you never discuss, you know. And there was that moment when there were discussions, you know, everywhere, you know. And there was a kind of you can say this is of course a kind of fake enthusiasm, but there was something there was a moment, you know, in which really people were living in another world. So you met people. I remember an old uncle. He was a man from. He was very old. He was a man of the third French Republic. And I remember. I visited him at that moment, and he was so enthusiastic. And he told me, oh, if you have a problem with the police, you knock on the door, and we will open. Well, that was at that moment. At the moment when. Well, people thought, they were living in a new world, or everything became possible. There was really that moment, nothing worked anymore. Everything was possible. And there was, of course, I think that there were probably many people that were not at all happy with this, But at the same time, there were so many people happy, to walk in the streets, etc., etc. And we had the same thing, I mentioned, those strikes that prolonged, in a way, the spirit of May '68. In 1995, there was a big strike, of all transportation, And it was the same, except that it was in winter. In winter, so it was cold, But there was a moment when people were happy, being all in the streets and walking, and even walking, as if precisely there is the idea that at a certain moment, you feel life differently, Of course, you can comment into with Deleuze, speaking of the revolution as producing new vibration, and of course you can be not satisfied, and you can say that, but new vibration is not enough, You want to change the world, but. Well, I think this is my experience. Because at the very beginning, of course, I was a good Marxist, with Althusserien. I thought it was ridiculous, the student movement, And then, there was the fact itself, that the whole society seemed to be really, really transformed, and it was quite striking, in the way people walked in the street, people spoke to each other in the streets, and this is. I think the same kind of things that happened, in many Occupy movements, recently. And I think that we must not despise this, saying that is only folklore. True revolution is something different. It's not so clear to know what true revolution means.
Okay, thank you so much again for your lecture. Yeah, thanks a lot for coming.